A little while back, I replayed God of War 2018, and ever since I've been thinking a lot about the Valkyrie side quest. It involves a challenging and engaging series of fights where you're pushed to learn the unique patterns of each Valkyrie and master new skills to overcome them. And not only is it satisfying to just get good enough to beat them, but they also provide players with a lot of materials and items that will make them far more powerful. The quest culminates with the best and hardest fight of the entire game against Sigrun, the Queen of the Valkyries, whose moveset is comprised of all the moves of the previous Valkyries, and she unleashes them against you at an overwhelming rate. What makes the fight so cool is that you already know how to beat her before going in. It's just about getting used to the pace of the fight and making as few mistakes as possible. Even though this was the third time I've finished this quest line, beating her felt incredible because the fight is that demanding, and regardless of how many times I learn it, every time I go back, it's just as hard. After the adrenaline wore off though, I looked over the spoils of the battle, which included the Retribution Pommel, a solid enchantment, and some crafting materials, all of which would help me become more powerful, and thought, what's the point of this shit? The progression of the Valkyrie questline is partially tied to progressing the main story, so even though not every player will face Sigrun at the exact same point, no matter what, it will happen pretty close to the end of the game, meaning these pieces of gear will mostly be used for just the final fight. The mileage of these rewards will be better for those who play New Game Plus, but as I am not one of those people, their usefulness was super limited. And what makes things worse is the final boss isn't even that hard. It is way easier than the Sigrun fight, and honestly easier than a lot of the Valkyrie fights. It has multiple checkpoints throughout, and no section is that long, so even if you do die, you're not going to lose much progress. Not to mention, in order to get strong enough to take on Sigrun, you'll almost certainly have to find and level up some of the best gear in the game, so mix that with the strong abilities earned from beating her, and it leaves you wildly overpowered for the main quest, causing the final boss to be a bit trivial. And to be clear, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Being able to decimate anything in your path because you did a ton of optional content can make you feel powerful, and like the extra work you did paid off, and that certainly is appealing to a lot of folks. Personally though, I feel let down when what should be a huge challenge isn't. It ends up feeling a bit anticlimactic. The final boss of a game doesn't need to be the hardest, but when they are one of the easier ones, it lessens their overall impact, and here that was caused by the rewards I got for doing the Valkyrie questline. Rewarding players seems like such an easy thing to do. You just give them something better than what they had before, but if done incorrectly or at the wrong time, it can throw off the balance of a game and lead to players feeling unsatisfied with the stuff that should make them feel great. It's not just about giving players something cool, it's about making them feel like they got something cool, and that might sound the same, but it is different. A lot more goes into the latter. Now, rewards come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes they are things you collect, sometimes they are things you use, sometimes they are stats you gain, sometimes they are progress you make, sometimes they are moments you experience, and within each of those categories there are many different levels of importance. Collecting a coin in Mario will give you a brief moment of feeling rewarded, but that will sustain you for about as long as it takes to grab it. But getting a star will make you feel better for longer and have more of an impact on how you move forward. Small rewards beget big rewards, and big rewards beget bigger rewards. Together, all kinds of rewards are used as breadcrumbs to help usher players along in a way that ideally leaves them feeling satisfied. And it's the question of how to make rewards actually feel satisfying that is so tough to answer. For the most part, rewards can largely be split into two categories, intended and optional, although there is some overlap between the two. Intended rewards are the things you are supposed to get. They're typically tied to the main line of progression and are composed of stuff the developers don't want you to miss. They come in the form of abilities that make up the core mechanics of the game, items that have a significance to both the story and gameplay, experience points earned from taking out the enemies on the primary path, and all sorts of other things. These rewards aren't necessarily mandatory, as many titles are a bit more open-ended than that, but more often than not, they are, and the ones that aren't are still pretty hard to miss. As developers can generally count on players receiving these rewards, games are often balanced around them, whether that be adding new challenges to account for new abilities or introducing stronger enemies to match higher leveled players. On the other end, optional rewards are things gathered by the player that aren't necessary to complete the game. game. These often contain similar things as the intended ones, like weapons and experience points and upgrades, but developers can't guarantee players will encounter them, so they tend to play less important of a role. Optional rewards are obviously tied to optional content, so it is much harder to balance the core part of the game around them, as it's impossible to predict how much of it any given player will engage with. For instance, if the developers balance a game for those who only do the main objective and nothing else, the main line of progression will become far too easy for those who get a handful of optional upgrades. And if they balance it for those who spend all their time treading off the beaten path, it will make the game extremely difficult for those who stick close to the main quest, essentially turning all optional content into mandatory content. So developers are faced with the task of picking a spot on that continuum that will feel satisfying to either the most amount of players possible or to the demographic they are primarily aiming to appeal to. The most common approach seems to be where games are balanced in a way that doesn't require doing specific optional content, otherwise it wouldn't be optional, but does call for doing some optional content in order to not fall behind the demands of the main part of the game. For example, in every Zelda title, you don't need to collect any one heart piece, but if you don't get any, combat will be much harder because of it, and unless you're really good, you'll probably die a lot and maybe not be able to beat the game, so you'll need to gather a handful of them at some point. With any optional reward like this, the strategy is to scatter so many across the world that even the least observant player will be able to stumble across a few of them. These can be done for big rewards like heart pieces or small ones like crafting materials, and the amount the player will need to collect of either will depend on their own skill as well as the scope of the game, but for the most part things lean on the side of not needing to do a ton of optional stuff. It's meant to present the game in a way where players will have somewhat unique experiences by delving into different optional content, but not be pushed into spending a wild amount of time on things that aren't the main story. Given that the majority of people who start a game are unlikely to even finish it, this sort of approach that has a more casual feel makes a fair bit of sense, as it lowers the risk of creating friction that might make the player abandon the game. So while this isn't universal, many titles end up containing a mixture of intended rewards, optional rewards that the developers intend players to collect a certain amount of, and purely optional rewards. And if this all sounds like it must be a nightmare to balance, that's because it is. No two people will approach a game in the exact same way, and while devs can attempt to fine-tune it for a certain type of player, most will still fall outside of that. At a glance, it may seem like optional rewards are the source of all this trouble, and it certainly does add a complex layer to it all, but to be honest, intended rewards on their own are a hard thing to get right. Like, how often should players be rewarded with something? Does it need to be an upgrade, or can it just be story progression? What sorts of things will even feel like a worthwhile reward? How will it affect the gameplay moving forward? There is a lot to answer and no one-size-fits-all solution, as every game is trying to accomplish something different. Also, depending on the title's focus, it might not need or even be able to reward the player in certain ways, but there certainly are patterns that we see a lot across games. So like for intended rewards, they usually are either tied to game progression or some form of character progression. Of the two, game progression is definitely the simpler type of reward, as it is focused on just giving the player more game to play. You finish a level and you're rewarded with a new one. You collect the MacGuffin and now you can open the big locked door to the next area. By making clear separations between content, it gives players a moment to celebrate the progression instead of taking it for granted. That's why we get flagpoles at the end of a stage and nice sound effects when a quest is completed, to make clear that something notable happened. As long as the game is enjoyable and players want to keep seeing more of it, presenting progression as a reward in these ways is a solid and relatively easy approach, even if it is a bit empty in terms of actual substance. Character progression, on the other hand, can be a far more powerful reward, but is also more complicated to pull off. It's all about providing new ways for the player to interact with the established world, whether that be through having higher stats or different moves or special items. Getting stronger is a central theme in many video games, and it is something most players are motivated by, so any sort of reward that helps build to that can go a long way. But this creates some challenges, one of the big ones being that games tend to get more difficult as they go along. So how can developers make a player feel like they're getting more powerful while also continuing to challenge them throughout? This can be accomplished in a few different ways, and it really all comes down to execution. For instance, in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, there are a handful of ways you can get stronger, but the two that feel most impactful come from collecting prayer beads and memories, with the former increasing your health and poise and the latter increasing your strength. Prayer beads are often a reward for taking out mini-bosses, and memories are a reward for beating the main bosses. For the most part though, these upgrades are offset by the fact that enemies get stronger in each new area. While they make it easier to go back to past locations, there's not much reason to spend a meaningful amount of time retreading those spots, so you won't be benefiting in that way all that often. Not to mention, some of those areas shift and become harder as the game progresses. progresses. By and large, these stat increases only serve to keep the player on pace with the increased stats of enemies. Essentially, it's inflation. It's a way to make you feel like you've been given something, like you've gotten better, but it doesn't really change the balance of things. It just feels like it does. Obviously, if you do all the optional fights, you will be a bit ahead of the curve, but even then, defeating the bosses still requires actual player skill, so it will still mostly feel like a consistent challenge. Now, if these upgrades were taken away and enemy health and damage didn't increase as you progressed, functionally things wouldn't be that different. But I do think it would feel different because, as dumb as it is, people like seeing number go up. Once you get deep into a game, it feels better to do 100 damage instead of 10, even if it is taking out the same percentage of an enemy's health. Something about it feels like progress. So for games that reward players with things like stat upgrades that mostly just boil down to doing a little more damage or taking a little less of it, it's more about the illusion of a character getting stronger than anything else. And Sekiro sells that illusion well. Generally, after beating the boss of an area and heading to the next location, the enemies there will be smaller and weaker, and can often be dispatched with just a few hits. Compared to the challenge of a boss, this makes the player feel as if they've gotten way stronger. As they continue along, enemies start to get more deadly and hard to deal with again, and then it all climaxes with the boss who takes a considerable amount of effort and skill to best. After that, the process repeats, allowing for that newfound strength to feel effective again. This approach rewards players both by acting as a release of tension and as a way to make their new, bigger numbers feel impactful, even if in the long run they aren't changing all that much. I don't think every game needs to aspire to this exact difficulty curve. Again, it all depends on what a title is trying to accomplish and who it is trying to appeal to, but I do think this approach has become so popular for a reason. It's a constant push and pull between power fantasy and intense challenge that can give rewards like stat upgrades a way to shine while still always asking for more from the player. And I think this is part of why enemy scaling generally feels a bit off. Having most things in a world level at the exact rate you do smooths out these peaks and valleys that offer much needed tension and release, in turn leading stat upgrades to feel less meaningful. Anyway, regardless of the fact that stat upgrades can be a solid enough reward if implemented cleverly, they are still an artificial kind of reward. Effective, yeah, but not all that interesting to actually get, as intended stat upgrades don't really do much to change the actual gameplay. So this is why I find rewards that truly shift the experience and not just my perception of the experience to be the most satisfying. A title I played recently that did this pretty well was Convergence: A League of Legends story. As you work through the game, you unlock new abilities, and almost every single one changes how you'll approach both platforming and combat. Having most of the abilities be useful in multiple ways made them feel really valuable, and as I implemented them into my playstyle more and more, I started to feel super powerful, especially in fights. And it wasn't because I just did more damage, it was because I could utilize my new abilities in a way that made me more effective and efficient. Each upgrade made the game more fun to play, leading to rewards always feeling great to get. In general, Metroidvanias like Convergence do a better job of rewarding players in this way because they kind of have to due to their core principles. If a world is created with barriers that can only be overcome through upgrades found on the journey, by default, players will have to be rewarded with said upgrades. These games are designed to regularly recontextualize how the player views the world, creating a lot of fertile ground for rewards that feel meaningful. And honestly, I imagine this is part of why Metroidvanias, especially ones that focus on adding upgrades that impact all aspects of gameplay, have become so prevalent. Players actually get something worthwhile and the gameplay is constantly evolving. Another genre that does this well and has become wildly popular are roguelites, where every run you get new rewards that completely change up how things work, leading to tons of fresh feeling gameplay. This isn't to say that every title should be based around abilities that constantly shift how things work. Not all games need to be optimized in this way, and if they were, it would lead to the entire industry feeling stale, but it definitely is the reward structure that I think has the highest potential for player satisfaction. Of course, not all upgrades that recontextualize how you play a game are created equal. Making multiple abilities that meaningfully fit into every phase of a game is a massive undertaking, and depending on the core gameplay loop, it can be especially hard to develop interesting and novel abilities to reward players with. And unfortunately, this sometimes leads to games rewarding them with things that make them engage with the game less instead of more. Take the famous not indie game, Dave the Diver. In it, you collect fish to sell at your sushi restaurant, which earns you money that can be spent on upgrades upgrades to help you get more fish and to sell more sushi at your restaurant. At first, this is all in service of growing the restaurant, and that's when the game feels at its best. You get more air in your tank to dive for longer and bigger storage to carry more fish on each go, and take on additional responsibilities at the restaurant in order to make more money and make customers happier. But this is pretty short-lived, and over time the focus shifts to a questline that doesn't have all that much to do with the restaurant. As this happens, the upgrades you'll start to unlock, like the fish nursery and better employees, lead to you doing the core part of the game less. Especially with the restaurant sections, by the mid-game, the employees cover the vast majority of responsibilities, and pretty much the only thing I was left to do was wash dishes. As for the diving part of it, once the nursery is unlocked, you don't need to catch nearly as many fish in order to be properly stocked at the restaurant, and really after only a bit of setup, it pretty much replaces the need to gather fish at all. These approaches solve the problem of the gameplay loop getting stale by just having you do less of it, which I don't think is an ideal solution. It'd feel much better if these gameplay aspects expanded in complexity instead of being simplified. And to be clear, that doesn't mean there can't be automated aspects. A game like Factorio is all about setting up automated systems that allow you to gather more resources, but as those systems expand in scope, new problems arise for the player to solve, meaning there is always something new and interesting to figure out. The upgrades in Dave the Diver, though, feel more like the be-all end-all. So as the focus shifts from supplying and managing the restaurant to completing story missions filled with really basic minigames and puzzles, it loses a lot of steam. It's a game that tries to do a little bit of everything, leading to it being a shallow experience. And while early on my brain was buzzing from constantly being rewarded for doing one thing or another, by the end all those rewards never grew into something that felt important or made the game more interesting. It's also worth noting that intended character progression isn't always just based around devs doling out specific stats and abilities at set points in order to make the player feel a certain way. For instance, skill trees give players control over what their character can do. While plenty of games end up having some skills on the tree that are mandatory or close to mandatory, for the most part the various choices on it represent just one viable way to approach the game. Players aren't just rewarded with a new ability, they are rewarded with the chance to choose the ability that they are most interested in, creating a sense of player agency and the potential for more replayability for those who want to go back and see other builds. A similar thing can be achieved with stats that the player gets to allocate themselves that are tied to weapon or ability requirements, but skill trees have definitely become the more popular option, mostly because of their simplicity. There are a few issues with them, of course, one being that not every ability on a path is something the player will actually use or be interested in using, but they may have to choose it in order to get to the things that they are actually working towards, causing the moment-to-moment progression to feel less satisfying. Also, as the player isn't guaranteed to have specific abilities, this makes it harder to design the world and encounters with any given ability in mind, potentially limiting the amount of interesting interactions the ability can have. And this is one of the same issues that comes up with purely optional rewards. Their importance has to be understated, as it isn't something all, or in some cases even most, players will come across. The more interesting an item, mechanic, or ability is, the more it begs the question of if it should just be a core part of the game. The logic being, if something is a certain level of cool and fun, then the player shouldn't miss it. So optional rewards tend to fall into this space of being good and valuable enough to still want to go after, but not so interesting that people may miss the best stuff in a game. Although some devs don't seem bothered at all by this idea. A recent example of a title like this is Animal Well. I won't spoil or show any specifics, as the thing that makes the game so neat is figuring stuff out for yourself, but it is filled with so many secrets that almost feel like they weren't meant to be discovered. In fact, I don't think a few of them really were. The wildest bit to me is that there are some major rewards that change up how you engage with the world dramatically that I imagine a lot of people who roll credits will never even see. For developers, doing this is a huge risk, as if things are easy to miss, then a lot of players will probably miss them and potentially be left feeling like the game was lacking in content. It takes the devs having a strong understanding of and a lot of trust in their target audience to pull this off. And I imagine most studios come to the conclusion that it's not a worthwhile risk. So instead we get a lot of stat upgrades, whether that be for the character themselves or their gear, weapons that oftentimes just do slightly more or different kinds of damage, and of course cosmetics, which don't have gameplay implications but do let you change up the visuals a bit. These rewards aren't bad. All of them have the capacity to shake things up just enough to keep you looking for more, and the ones that improve stats will add to that feeling of progressing a character that players crave. but they don't feel as important, and they also have a number of costs. One being that if the player is rewarded with too many different things, they might not have much use for a lot of it. Consider Elden Ring. It has an overwhelming amount of places to explore and rewards to get. Everywhere you go will net you runes for leveling up, and oftentimes a few materials that you'll almost certainly make use of, so you're never going to walk out of a place having gathered nothing of value. However, when clearing a cave or a crypt, the major reward for killing a boss generally will be a new weapon or spell, and most of the time you won't even be able to use it. It's great that you get a unique reward, and as FromSoft is FromSoft, the weapons rarely just offer stat upgrades. They'll also provide unique movesets that will have some impact on how you approach combat, but as everything in the game has stat requirements, you can't experiment with a new weapon or spell the moment you get it. To get a real feel for it, you need to respec your character, which uses a limited resource. And for weapons, in order to see how it compares to your previous one, you'll need to upgrade it. And while most of the smithing stones are not finite, you're not exactly drowning in them either. It would take a lot of grinding to get enough to upgrade multiple weapons meaningfully. So while there is excitement to not knowing what you might come across, the reality is most of the time the actual reward is not for you. The solution to this issue is to just have a few set rewards that the player will pretty much always want to get, and this is how Tears of the Kingdom does it. Like its predecessor, Tears of the Kingdom has a small pool of rewards that are all tied to doing specific things, so players will generally know exactly what they're going to get based on the thing they're engaging with. Doing a shrine will net them a Light of Blessing, exploring the depths will bring them Zonite and crystallized charges, clearing out caves will get them bubble gems, and so on and so on. All of these things have pretty obvious value, and as players will almost always know what they're going to get, they can prioritize doing the stuff that will give them rewards that will be most useful to them. Now, the problem with this method is it becomes super repetitive. For a game that props itself up as one where you uncover secrets, what you actually uncover rarely is one. It's probably just a Korok seed. Also, if one type of reward isn't of all that much use to how you approach the game, then you'll be more likely to stop interacting with whatever place gets you that reward, making large swaths of the world no longer relevant to you. There are a few bigger quests where the reward is unclear, but there's really only one instance where you get a permanent reward that feels unique, and it's awesome. But for a game of this size, it should happen way more. Most of the time, it is just a bigger version of the stuff you normally get, and I don't know, there is nothing quite as deflating as doing a long, mysterious quest to find that there is just a heart piece at the end of it. So naturally, the solution to this issue is to have unique rewards within every place you explore, and yeah, the point is both approaches can lead to a fair bit of disappointment. And look, these are two of my favorite games, so it's not as if these reward structures ruin them. It's just that they don't always provide the satisfaction they're meant to. I think one of the biggest ways that takes shape in both games touches back on the problem that I talked about at the start of this video, that collecting too many optional rewards can make things too easy. Especially in Elden Ring, optional content acts as a way to essentially augment the difficulty. While this is great for those struggling, it acts almost as a consequence for more skilled players who like to explore and also want things to always feel challenging. This leaves some players having to choose between one experience or the other. And to bring it back fully, this is why the Valkyrie quest in God of War 2018 left me feeling so conflicted. I lost out on a certain experience by engaging with optional content. Now, there are ways developers try to address this. For instance, with God of War 2018, even though doing the Valkyrie questline makes you overpowered for the main part of the game, you do still have to take on the Valkyries, who are extremely challenging. So those looking to be pushed to their limits might not get that from the main game, but will from the side content, which is something, even if the timing for it is kind of off. To Sony Santa Monica's credit, the sequel, God of War Ragnarok, improves things a bit by placing the hardest optional fights in the post-game, so the rewards you get from them won't impact anything in the main part of the game, but it does also make the gear you get feel even more pointless, as these fights will probably be the last things you do. To be honest, both feel like half measures. I much prefer when games take the next step of rewarding the completion of side content with unlocking a new challenge that is tied to the main content. The prime example that I've talked about in the past and will talk about again in the future, you can't stop me, is Hollow Knight. Doing the optional stuff will get you more abilities and charms and health and soul, generally making the main bosses easier, but also doing pretty much everything unlocks the true final boss, who is a considerable challenge. In some ways, it ends up being the best of both worlds, because to access the true final boss, you still have to fight the original final boss, and for those who have taken their time to collect everything to get to this point, he will be kind of a pushover, allowing you to live the power fantasy while also still being challenged by what comes next. The last thing you do will also be the hardest thing you do, and the reward of relief from being done with it feels feels better than anything else could. And you also get a more satisfying ending to the story, which is great as well. I do get why God of War 2018 didn't follow this exact approach. Having the Valkyrie questline change the main questline in a meaningful way would most likely require the game to have a significantly different ending for the new path, and as the title is very intentional with the story it is trying to tell, a split like this would work against creating the impact it's aiming to make. I do still think it would have been a more interesting way to do it, but they clearly didn't want their best emotional beats to be missable, as that would make the climax not hit as hard and the sequel be more confusing for those who didn't do it. This is understandable, but I do find myself wishing more developers were unafraid of whether or not people encountered the best parts of their game. That is the beauty of optional content and rewards. Not everyone will experience them. They are something the player has to work to uncover, and as they're not just readily handed over, it feels exclusive and special. It feels like forming your own narrative. It has to be earned, and when the reward is something that feels substantial, that isn't what you normally expect to be rewarded with, there is something about being a player who earned it that feels spectacular. And I don't even think it's about other people missing it. Instead, it's knowing that you so easily could have that makes it hit so hard. I think with a lot of games, the type of player who would most enjoy pursuing optional rewards, that being those who love a challenge, who revel in uncovering mysteries, who want to get the most out of a game, aren't who they are designed for. And even though I think that is a bit of a shame, I do struggle to say that they should be designed for that kind of player, because at the end of the day, it makes sense why devs would focus more on the experience of the average player rather than of this relatively small subsection. Developing a game involves spinning many plates, and while it is easy to say that every title should have meaningful optional content that elevates the experience and gives players a new challenge to engage with, that can't and won't be a priority for every developer. To get made, games need to be able to sell, so design and balance decisions will always be impacted by that. Rewards are a necessary but flawed part of games. They can help signify the importance of a task, offer ways to evolve what a title is about, and motivate players to play more. However, they also can trivialize the core gameplay of a title, provide you with something you'll never actually use, and become predictable and stale to collect. Making rewards feel good is a delicate balance that goes beyond the pure function of a thing and into the player's perception of a thing, which is immensely difficult to manage. However, when devs get close, the immediate positive feedback that comes from doing a thing and getting something for it is an amazing feeling to experience, especially as it isn't something we typically get in our daily lives. You generally don't get paid the moment you're done doing a task, you don't find cool and useful stuff that's also free by just looking around for it, and you can't just put a point into a skill to master it. You need time and patience. Rewards in real life are often delayed, but rewards in games let you know that you're doing the right thing right as you do it, and that is immensely appealing. Which is why I love when titles get it right. I don't expect my issues with how many games do rewards to go away. Like most aspects of game design, it is impossible to balance perfectly for each and every player, but I do hope to keep seeing titles that push the boundaries of what rewards can be, so that I can feel surprised and delighted when I earn them. Sometimes though, the best reward you can get is the one you give yourself. Like, I don't know, a backpack with more hidden pockets than you could imagine, or a sling that lets you have a fanny pack without having to admit that you have a fanny pack, or a tech kit that can cleanly carry your Switch or other small bits of equipment. And of course, you can get all these things from this video's sponsor, Bellroy. Bellroy makes a ton of awesome products that are all focused on keeping you organized and looking stylish. They provide functional yet sleek ways to carry your stuff, and they do a lot to minimize the environmental impacts of making things by using sustainable materials like Ecotan leather and recycled nylon. I genuinely use Bellroy products every day, and I've bought from them in the past and I will buy from them again in the future, which is about as good of a recommendation as I can give. So yeah, if you're like me and love quality bags and cool little accessories, click the link in the description to get 10% off anything at Bellroy.com. Whatever you go with, I bet it will help you out in one way or another. Also, they make great gifts to give to other people, so you can do that too. Anyway, thanks to Bellroy for sponsoring this video. For all of you still here, hello. I'd like to give a massive thank you to my patrons for making this channel possible. It helps more than you know. I hope you all have a great day and or night, and I will see you in the next one.